In Burke County, Georgia, 1839, the air itself seemed to hum with secrets. Tucked between acres of dying cotton and slow-turning river marshes stood a quiet estate, Ravenshade Plantation. By daylight, it looked serene, white columns gleaming, magnolia trees in bloom, the rhythmic hum of cicadas wrapping the house in southern peace. But after sunset, that same calm seemed to hold its breath, as if something in the soil still listened. The lady of the house was Margaret Holloway, wife of Magistrate Thomas Holloway, a man known for his discipline, his iron sense of order, and his unwavering belief that every soul had its proper place. To the townsfolk, they were the picture of refinement, a respectable couple whose faith and fortune anchored local society. But those who worked beneath them knew better. They saw how rarely the magistrate spoke to his wife, how often her gaze wandered toward the horizon, how many nights her candle burned long after midnight. The loneliness of Ravenshade crept into Margaret's bones. Her husband's world was ruled by law, hers by silence. And in that silence she found herself drawn again and again to the old stone bathhouse at the edge of the property, a relic from before her marriage, built with rough hands and colder intentions. There, amid the steam and dim candlelight, she began to feel something watching her. The slaves whispered that the bathhouse was not empty, that the water below its floor came from an underground spring where people once bathed the bodies of the dead before burial, and that sometimes, on moonless nights, the reflection in the water was not one's own. At first the story seemed like superstition, until Margaret began visiting the place more often, alone. Servants claimed they heard her murmuring softly as if in conversation. One night, a field hand named Elias was sent to carry water to her room, and by morning he was gone. The magistrate demanded silence, and in Ravenshade, silence was easy to keep. As weeks passed, Margaret's behavior grew stranger. She moved slower, smiled at nothing, and was often found tracing circles on her wrist, faint marks that resembled clasped hands as though someone had held her too tightly. When questioned, she said only one thing: "The water listens better than people do." On the first frost of winter, Thomas Holloway finally entered the bathhouse himself, drawn by what he swore was his wife's laughter echoing from within. What he found there would never be written in any official record. The only surviving words appear in a brittle diary discovered beneath the foundation decades later. "I am not alone in the water. And I am no longer afraid." Today, the remains of Ravenshade Plantation are little more than stone and memory. Locals say the bathhouse still stands half sunken in the swamp, the water inside unnaturally clear as though forever waiting. Some claim to have seen a woman's shape in that reflection, standing where no one stands. Others say the air smells faintly of lilac and smoke when she appears. If you ever found yourself in Burke County and stumbled upon that crumbling ruin, would you dare to look into the water? Tell me what you think really happened. In Georgia, 1839. The autumn air clung to Ravenshade like a damp veil. By late October, the days had shortened into long amber evenings that bled into the kind of darkness only the Georgia countryside could hold, heavy, humid, and filled with the chorus of unseen things. Inside the great house, the lamps were lit early, but Margaret Holloway still felt the gloom pressing in. Her husband, Magistrate Thomas Holloway, had left for Augusta 3 days earlier to preside over a land dispute, and though the servants kept the household running in perfect rhythm, the silence had become unbearable. The house creaked in his absence. It was not the usual sound of settling timber, it was something deeper, slower, like breath shifting through old lungs. Margaret told herself it was imagination, yet by the third night she found herself walking through the halls in her nightdress, candle in hand, searching for the source of the noise that would not let her sleep. Her feet carried her, almost against her will, toward the bathhouse by the orchard. It stood at the edge of the property where the grass turned wild and the ground dipped into marsh. The structure was simple: stone walls, wooden rafters, a roof half covered in creeping vines. No one used it anymore. Not since 1834, when a servant drowned there under strange circumstances. Margaret had not entered it in years. But that night, she felt as though something in her chest pulled her toward it, a strange warmth beneath her ribs as though she were walking toward the only thing still awake with her. The key still hung on the iron hook by the kitchen. It was cold in her hand when she slipped it into the heavy door lock. The hinges groaned softly, releasing a rush of air that smelled of stone, candle wax, and something older, like a cellar left sealed too long. The lantern on the wall still burned oil. She lit it, and its dim glow trembled across the bath water, black and still as glass. The room was round, with a single copper tub set into the floor, fed by a spring that ran beneath the plantation. The same spring that, according to the slaves, never froze, not even in winter. Margaret stepped closer. Her reflection floated before her, a pale ghost framed by shadow. Her hair, once chestnut, had begun to pale at the edges. Her face looked older than 37. There were faint hollows beneath her eyes, and her lips carried the trace of a frown she had not felt forming. She touched the surface of the water. It was warm. For a moment she closed her eyes. The warmth was soothing, almost intimate, and when she pulled her hand back, her fingertips tingled. A whisper of air stirred behind her, soft, deliberate, but when she turned no one stood there. Only the faint sway of the lantern's flame. Her pulse quickened. A sensible woman would have left. But Margaret had lived her whole life obeying the sensible. And it had left her hollow. She set the candle by the tub, loosened the ties of her gown and stepped into the water. The warmth embraced her instantly. It rose up her legs, her waist, her shoulders, the air filling with the faint scent of lilac and earth. For the first time in years she felt alive. Not watched, not judged, just seen in some impossible way. Her eyes drifted shut, her head resting against the smooth stone edge. She thought she heard a breath, not her own, exhale through the chamber. When she opened her eyes, ripples spread across the surface, though no movement disturbed the air. A chill shivered through her body. "Who's there?" she whispered. The silence deepened. And then, faintly, she heard it, a voice beneath the water, low and distant, like a hymn sung through stone. She could not make out the words. Only the sound, rhythmic and mournful. She leaned forward. The surface quivered, just slightly, and in the reflection beside her, another face appeared. It was dark, strong, unfamiliar. For a heartbeat she thought it was memory, a shadow cast by the flame, but then the reflection moved independently of her own. It blinked. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The air grew colder, the lantern sputtered. Then, as quickly as it had come, the reflection faded, leaving only her pale face and trembling hand. She rose from the tub, heart hammering. The warmth of the water clung to her skin like breath. There were prints on her arm, faint but undeniable, the shape of fingers darker than her own. The next morning she told herself it was a dream. She dressed early, visited the stables, and carried herself through the day with perfect composure. But the mark did not fade. That night she returned to the bathhouse. This time she did not hesitate. The water was waiting for her, already warm, already still. She slid into it with a strange hunger, her mind whispering that she would find answers here, that whatever she had touched was not madness but memory. She spoke softly, voice trembling. "I am here. If you can hear me, show yourself." The candle flickered, the air trembled. And then she felt it, a hand brushing gently across her back. Not cruelly, not in violence, but as though something unseen had been longing too. A gasp escaped her lips, part fear, part wonder. The touch lingered, spreading warmth through her entire body. When she opened her eyes again, the water no longer reflected her alone. 3 silhouettes stood around her, faint, wavering like smoke caught in moonlight. Tall, silent, their forms shifting between flesh and shadow. "Who are you?" she whispered. The figures did not answer. One reached forward, touching the surface near her hand. The ripples spread, glowing faintly, silver and black, until her skin shimmered under the water's sheen. And then a voice, soft, resonant, like memory speaking through water. "You called us." Margaret's tears blurred the lantern light. Her voice shook. "I didn't mean to." "You were heard," the voice said. "And now you remember." A flood of visions swept through her mind, faces not hers submerged in water centuries ago, bodies lowered into this same spring, songs of mourning sung by the enslaved who worked the land before her family's time. She saw them washing the dead, whispering blessings. The water had carried every word, every sorrow, every secret. When the vision faded, Margaret was alone again, but she no longer felt fear. She rose from the tub, trembling, and saw her reflection one final time. Her gray eyes now shimmered with something new, something ancient. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying faint echoes of voices long gone. And in that whisper Margaret understood. The water beneath Ravenshade did not forget. It remembered everyone it had ever touched, and now it remembered her. The nights in Georgia had a way of stretching endlessly, especially for those who carried secrets. For Margaret, each dusk brought the same haunting ache, an emptiness that her husband's absence could no longer explain. The magistrate spent his evenings buried in court papers or drinking with fellow men of the county, leaving his wife to her silence. The silence had grown thick now, so thick she could almost hear it breathing. The bathhouse stood a short walk from the manor, half hidden behind the oaks. It was built of dark timber, once meant for privacy and rest, but now it looked like something from a dream half remembered. Each time she stepped toward it, the air around her seemed heavier, as if the ground itself sighed beneath her bare feet. At first, her visits were innocent, a means to escape, to soak in warmth and wash away the loneliness. But over the past few nights, something had changed. She had begun to feel watched. Not in the cruel, judging way of men, but something softer, curious. Like the air itself leaned closer when she undressed. Tonight, the candlelight flickered strangely. Shadows danced on the walls, stretching like long fingers. Margaret slipped into the water, her white nightgown floating like a veil around her. The water was cool at first, then warmed quickly, almost unnaturally so. She closed her eyes. The scent of soap, lavender oil, and something faintly metallic, like iron. Then came a ripple, gentle. Then another. Her eyes snapped open. No wind. No sound. Yet the water moved. Margaret whispered to herself, "It's just the air. Just the pipes." But there were no pipes. The bathhouse had no running water, only the old well beneath it. She leaned back, exhaling slowly. The warmth pressed around her shoulders like hands, soothing, coaxing. A whisper followed, soft, almost like a breath against her ear. "Stay." Her heart raced. She sat upright, scanning the corners, but the room was empty. The whisper came again, this time from behind her, just above the surface of the water. "Stay." Her first instinct was to flee, to run barefoot through the grass back to the house, but she didn't. Instead, she whispered back, "Who's there?" The reply was only a ripple. Then beneath the surface she saw it, a shape, faint and shadowy. Not a reflection. A figure. Shoulders, arms, the outline of a man beneath the water. She gasped and backed away, trembling. Yet when she reached the edge, she didn't climb out. She stared into the water, and the longer she looked, the calmer she felt. Something about it felt familiar. She lowered a trembling hand back into the bath, fingers brushing the surface. The warmth returned instantly, curling around her hand like smoke. A pulse, faint, rhythmic, throbbed beneath the water. Margaret whispered, "Elias?" The name slipped from her without thought, the name of the young man who had once tended her garden, whose body they'd never found after he drowned in the estate's pond 2 summers ago. The air thickened. The water rippled harder. Her heartbeat slowed, not from fear but recognition. Something inside her, something buried deep, wanted to believe it was him. The whisper came again, closer this time, brushing the nape of her neck. "You remember me?" She shuddered. Tears welled in her eyes, not from terror but longing. That night she didn't run. She stayed until the candles burned out, until the water grew cold again and the whispers faded. But she returned the next night. And the one after. Each time the presence grew stronger. She began to see the outline more clearly, a man's face half submerged, his features soft and sorrowful, his skin pale beneath the rippling light. She spoke to him now, asking questions. The answers never came in words, only in sensations, warmth, ripples, the faint pressure of fingers tracing her arm. She told herself it was madness. That her mind, starved of affection, had invented this ghost to fill the void. But deep down she knew it wasn't madness. It was hunger. One night, as rain lashed the plantation roof, she came to the bathhouse again. Her white gown clung to her, soaked from the storm. She entered the water, trembling but not from cold. The candles flickered violently, then steadied. The room seemed to breathe. "Elias," she whispered. "If you're real, show me." The water rippled, and from its depths 2 hands emerged, translucent, veined with darkness, trembling with longing. They rose slowly, stopping just short of her skin. Margaret closed her eyes, tears mixing with rainwater on her face. "Please," she whispered, "don't leave me alone." The hands touched her. At first it was nothing but warmth, then pressure. The unmistakable feel of another's body, though no one was there. Her breath hitched. Her back arched slightly. The sensation was tender, reverent, not violent. She could feel his presence all around her, the water moving like it obeyed him. A strange calm washed over her, love, sorrow, need, all tangled together. The air filled with whispers, many voices now, overlapping, men's soft, mourning, aching. The spirits of the drowned, slaves who had perished unseen, forgotten, had found her. And through her grief they found life again. When she finally left the water, her skin glowed faintly beneath the candlelight. Her gown clung to her like a second skin, and her reflection in the mirror looked different, younger, alive. But behind her reflection she could see them, faint shadows of men standing silently in the mist. Watching. Waiting. That night she slept not alone. The whispers followed her into her dreams. And when she awoke, the side of her bed was wet, as though someone had lain beside her, leaving only the scent of damp earth and lavender. By the autumn of 1839, Willowbend had grown quieter, though not peaceful. The plantation's workers whispered that something unseen walked the corridors of the main house after sundown. The candles flickered even when there was no wind. Distant laughter, soft, womanly, carried from the bathhouse near the creek long after midnight. Samuel Holt, a house servant of 27, had noticed these things more than anyone. He was not a superstitious man by nature, but the air in Willowbend had turned strange, heavy, almost intimate. He first sensed it in the way the mistress, Margaret Rutledge, began to move. She no longer glided through the halls with her practiced grace. She drifted as if guided by something invisible. At dinner, her eyes unfocused. At dawn, her sheets were damp with the smell of river water. Samuel had been the one to empty the basin by her bed and noticed the faint outline of muddy footprints on the floorboards, bare, delicate, but leading toward the open window. He should have ignored them, but curiosity gnawed at him harder than fear. On the third night of September he followed her. The night was still, the air thick with the scent of decaying magnolia. Margaret carried no lantern, only a candle cupped in her palm. The flame wavered as she crossed the yard toward the bathhouse. Samuel kept to the shadows, the weight of his sin pressing with every step. When she reached the door he saw her pause, not with hesitation but with recognition. "Are you here?" she whispered. Her voice was soft, trembling, not with fear but anticipation. Samuel waited outside, his back pressed to the wall. From within came the sound of water shifting, as though something had risen from the depths to greet her. Her candlelight flickered against the window glass, painting restless silhouettes on the boards. For a moment Samuel saw her reflection, her hands raised as though tracing a face that wasn't hers. The sound that followed was neither scream nor sob. It was something between, a human sound stripped bare of reason. He should have left. Instead he stepped closer to the window, drawn by an urge that felt both shameful and inevitable. Inside, Margaret knelt by the bath, murmuring words he couldn't hear. The steam twisted around her like smoke from an invisible fire. And then, just for an instant, Samuel saw movement in the water. Not a reflection. A shape. It rose behind her, faintly human, its shoulders broad, its head bowed as though in reverence. She did not recoil. She leaned into it. The water shimmered with heat though the air outside had turned cold. Samuel stumbled backward, heart pounding. Yet when Margaret emerged later that night, her face looked calm, radiant even. She walked past him without noticing, eyes still fixed on something far beyond this world. The next morning the house felt different. Margaret hummed softly while arranging flowers in the parlor, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. The servants exchanged glances. Her cheeks held color again, her voice carried warmth it hadn't in months. "Mrs. Rutledge seems herself again," the cook whispered. Samuel said nothing but his mind burned. That night, when he passed her door to deliver the evening tray, he saw the candle still burning inside, and the faint sound of water dripping though no basin stood nearby. Days passed. Her eyes began to follow Samuel. At first it was only a glance, an absent, lingering look. But then in the garden she spoke. "Samuel," she said softly, "you've been loyal." He bowed his head, unsure whether to answer. "You've seen things," she continued. "Felt the air in this house. Tell me, do you believe in what you cannot see?" "I believe what I've seen, ma'am," he said carefully. Her smile was faint. "Then you know there are presences here. They mean no harm. They seek warmth, comfort." She turned away before he could answer, leaving him with a chill that wasn't entirely fear. That night, Samuel went to the bathhouse alone. He told himself it was curiosity, not desire. Yet as he stepped into the damp air, the same strange scent met him. Iron, salt, and something sweet like crushed gardenias. The moonlight shimmered across the pool. For a long moment he saw nothing. Then, faintly, the water rippled and a voice, not hers, whispered his name. He ran, but by morning he couldn't remember why. Only that his dreams had been full of hands reaching through water and lips that spoke promises he could not resist. Margaret saw him in the hallway the next day. Her expression was calm, knowing. "You shouldn't have gone there," she said quietly. "They don't like to share." The words stayed with him. Within days the house began to change again. Doors opened on their own. Mirrors fogged even when no one bathed. Margaret's mood swung between tenderness and fury. Once she accused Samuel of watching her too closely. The next moment she wept and touched his hand in apology. The boundary between haunting and desire blurred until neither of them knew who reached for whom. By the time the autumn harvest ended, the servants avoided the bathhouse altogether. They said the water no longer reflected faces, only shapes. And in the journals later recovered from Margaret Rutledge's room, one final entry from October 3, 1839, was written in trembling ink. He saw them. He felt them. Now they want him too. By late summer of 1839, the oppressive Georgia heat weighed heavily over Burke County, wrapping the cotton fields, the creeks, and the red brick walls of Willowbend in a heavy, unrelenting humidity. The cicadas screamed their endless chant, and even the house seemed to exhale slowly, as though reluctant to reveal the secrets it held within its walls. For Eleanor Whitmore, the magistrate's wife, the suffocating heat was not the most unbearable weight. It was the house itself, alive, silent, yet vibrating with the remnants of desires and obsessions that no one dared to name aloud. The household had grown tense. Eleanor wandered the corridors in the early hours, her silk slippers left behind as she padded barefoot over the polished floors. She carried a single candle, its flame wavering in the drafts that whispered through the cracked windows. Servants whispered behind closed doors, exchanging uneasy glances when she passed. Her voice, once precise and commanding, now trembled as she murmured prayers or verses she seemed to remember backwards. "Something walks here," she said once to no one, "and it knows my name." The mirror room became the center of her unease. A narrow chamber on the second floor, it had once been used for fitting gowns and practicing her carriage lessons. Each wall was lined with tall, gilded mirrors, their surfaces gleaming in the daylight. Eleanor had ordered all the mirrors draped in white sheets after claiming they breathed, at night, reflecting shapes that did not exist. The servants, initially skeptical, now avoided the room entirely, muttering that they felt eyes following them even when the room was empty. One night, Amos, the butler, discovered her standing there again, candle in hand, sheets pulled aside, her reflection fractured in the glass. The candlelight shimmered across her pale face, her wide gray eyes fixed on her own reflection as though searching for someone hidden behind it. "I saw him," she whispered, barely audible. "Thomas, but he is gone. He is buried. Why does he return?" Amos said nothing. He only bowed and left the room quickly, leaving the door ajar so the candlelight flickered against the walls like a slow heartbeat. By mid-September, Eleanor's behaviors grew stranger. She refused to eat meals at the dining room table, sending servants away with curt instructions while she lingered in the drawing room, her hands tracing invisible lines along the woodwork. The children, too young to understand, were sent to relatives in Savannah, leaving the house eerily silent. Even the birds in the surrounding trees had fallen silent. The servants began to notice that the air of Willowbend had shifted, becoming heavy and suffocating, carrying scents that were neither pleasant nor natural, a mix of iron, river mud, and faintly sweet decay. Caleb, the blacksmith, claimed he saw Eleanor reflected in the window of the forge, even though she had not left the main house all week. His eyes were wide with terror when he recounted how she had appeared, standing with her back to him, yet her reflection in the glass turned to meet him. That same night, Caleb was found by the cotton press at dawn, his posture unnaturally rigid, a look of horror frozen on his face. The coroner wrote it off as an accident. Nobody believed him. Eleanor's journals from these weeks contained only fragmented phrases. "They are not gone. The cellar hums when the moon wanes. If I am the vessel, then who is the voice?" As autumn settled over the Savannah River Valley, whispers spread beyond the walls of Willowbend. Townsfolk from Westboro began to murmur about the magistrate's wife, about the strange lights and sounds at night, about a woman who wandered barefoot through empty halls muttering to herself. Reverend Pembroke was sent to perform a ritual cleansing. On entering the house, he noted a strong scent of salt water, though the river was miles away. Eleanor refused to see him, shouting through the closed doors that the covenant had been made, and not even God can break it now. 2 nights later, the Reverend's horse returned to town alone, his saddle dripping mud, the rider nowhere to be found. His hat hung on the bathhouse door like a silent accusation. The servants began to speak in hushed tones about Eleanor as if she were no longer their mistress but something else entirely, a woman who wore her skin like a mask while a stranger moved beneath it. Late one evening, Eleanor lingered in the mirror room again, the air so heavy it seemed to push against her skin. Candlelight flickered on the mirrors and for the first time she saw more than her own reflection. Shapes moved behind her in the glass, indistinct, shadowy but clearly human. Figures stood in the corners of each mirror, always just behind her, observing, waiting. She stumbled back, heart hammering, and heard footsteps on the floor behind her. Turning, she found no one. The candle trembled in her hand. The mirrors reflected only her pale, terrified face, and then in a flash she thought she saw someone smile back at her. Not her own smile, but a thin, knowing expression that vanished the moment she blinked. From that night onward she slept poorly. She heard whispers in the walls, soft and unintelligible, and footsteps echoing in the hallways when she was certain she was alone. Even Samuel Holt, the servant who had first noticed her wandering, stayed away from the mirror room, muttering that he could feel eyes watching from the glass. By the end of October, the house seemed to pulse with life. The ceilings creaked like sighs, the floorboards whispered beneath their own weight. Eleanor felt eyes upon her constantly, and the servants dared not look directly at her for fear that their glances might summon what lay beyond. The final weeks of October brought the first overt sign that Willowbend had begun to claim its victims. Servants reported objects moving of their own accord, chairs tilted slightly, silverware rearranged, and the sound of water dripping where no basin stood. Eleanor wrote feverishly in her journal, describing each event with mounting terror. They are learning patience. I am their lesson. Every shadow a hand. Every mirror a mouth. Samuel's eyes lingered too long. He has seen what no man should witness. And I. Her entries ended abruptly. One evening, as the wind howled across the estate, Eleanor heard a familiar sound, the gentle splash of water from the bathhouse. Candle in hand, she crept through the darkened corridors. The air was thick, heavy, almost suffocating. The sound grew louder as she approached, and for a moment she swore she saw a figure moving beneath the surface. It vanished as she stepped closer. The candle flickered violently, casting shadows that danced along the walls. Eleanor's breath caught, and she whispered to herself, almost in prayer, that she would not succumb. But Willowbend was patient. And it had been waiting a long time. The chapter ends with Eleanor standing at the threshold of the bathhouse, candle trembling in her hand, her reflection fractured in the damp glass of the window. The water ripples. Something stirs. And she realizes that whatever it is, it has been waiting just for her. By the first week of November 1839, whispers about Willowbend Plantation had spread beyond Burke County. Travelers passing through Westboro reported odd lights at night, the faint sound of footsteps echoing across the fields, and a peculiar chill that clung to the air even when the sun rose high. Locals claimed that Eleanor Whitmore, once a lady of refinement and composure, now wandered the halls barefoot, speaking to shadows as if they were old acquaintances. The magistrate, Thomas Whitmore, though preoccupied with his civic duties, could no longer ignore the murmurs. Reports of servants falling ill, of objects moving on their own, and of Eleanor's erratic behavior reached the county office. Thomas wrote letters urging calm, but he too felt unease when he entered Willowbend. The familiar rooms seemed wrong. The chandeliers cast longer shadows than usual, and the mirrors reflected more than just the occupants. In late November, a man named Jonathan Pemberton, an investigator and scrivener from Savannah, arrived at the estate. Commissioned by the county to ensure that no foul play had occurred with the sudden illnesses and deaths reported, Pemberton approached Willowbend with the caution of a man who had heard too many tales of restless spirits in the lowlands. The main house, when Pemberton entered, seemed empty at first. The door creaked on its hinges as if warning him away. Servants scurried past silently, heads bowed. Even the wind seemed hesitant. Eleanor greeted him in the parlor, her eyes wide, unblinking, gray and pale as winter fog. "Mr. Pemberton," she said, her voice a brittle whisper, "you have come to see the truth." Pemberton noted the tension in her posture, the unnatural stillness of her movements, and the faint tremor in her hands as she gestured toward the halls. "I am here to record the facts, Madam Whitmore," he replied cautiously, "to see if the reports from Westboro are founded." He began with interviews, starting with the servants. Amos, the butler, spoke first, his words careful, deliberate. "The mistress, she wanders at night," he said. "Sometimes she speaks to people no one else can see. And the mirrors, sir, the mirrors are not as they should be." The cook, Mrs. Grady, added, "Things move where no hand has touched. The water in the bathhouse ripples though the tap is dry. And Samuel Holt, he seems changed. Eyes too watchful, whispers in corners." Pemberton took notes diligently, writing each phrase with the weight of a man who sensed danger in the quiet pauses between words. He examined the house room by room, finding subtle signs of disturbance. Furniture slightly off-angle, candle wax melted into strange patterns, and walls that seemed damp though no rain had entered. When he entered the mirror room, Pemberton paused. The mirrors, though covered in sheets, seemed to breathe as though expanding and contracting in a rhythm too slow for human perception. A faint chill crept along his neck. Eleanor watched silently, her hands folded, pale and trembling. "I see it too," she whispered almost to herself. "It watches, waits, and remembers everything." Over the following days the investigator recorded his observations. He noted Eleanor Whitmore, increasingly detached, wandering at all hours, speaking to unseen entities, obsessive about mirrors and reflections. The servants, fearful, avoiding the mirror room and bathhouse, quietly refusing tasks that required them to stay in the main house at night. Samuel Holt, strangely alert, always near Eleanor, silent, attentive as if sensing unseen threats. He also noted an odd pattern in Eleanor's journals, repeated references to a covenant, a promise she claimed had bound her to the house itself, and mentions of voices that echoed through the walls. Pemberton could not determine whether Eleanor was experiencing psychological breakdown or something else, something outside the realm of human understanding. At night, he could hear it too, faint, indistinct murmurs coming from behind the walls, a soft chorus of sighs and whispers. The sound seemed to come from the mirror room, then the bathhouse, then the corridors, always shifting, always just beyond the reach of his candlelight. One evening, Pemberton decided to explore the cellar. Eleanor had always forbidden entry, claiming it held things not meant to be seen. Ignoring her warnings, he descended the stairs, candle in hand. The air was thick and musty, redolent of old wood and damp earth. At the very bottom, he found evidence of the estate's long history. Old trunks, ledgers, and a set of journals that predated Eleanor's arrival. Among the journals were entries written in a hand far older, describing rituals, unusual deaths, and a peculiar pattern of servants falling ill under mysterious circumstances. Pemberton realized that Eleanor was not merely haunted, she was inheriting something, a weight of secrecy and unrecorded history that had gripped Willowbend for generations. As he turned to leave, he noticed a faint trail of water leading to a small iron door at the back of the cellar. The door was warped as if it had been opened many times, and a faint glow escaped from the cracks. Pemberton hesitated but then pushed it open. Beyond was a tiny vaulted room, empty except for the reflection of the candle on damp stone walls. The reflection shimmered strangely as if the walls themselves were liquid. A sudden noise behind him made him spin. Eleanor's voice floated down from above. "Do not look too long, Mr. Pemberton. The house remembers everything." The next day he recorded a final observation. The estate had begun to claim its victims not through violence, but through unease. Servants refused to remain after sunset. Furniture shifted inexplicably. Water pools in the bathhouse would ripple when no one disturbed them. Eleanor herself wandered as if tethered to the house by an invisible thread. Even Samuel Holt seemed alert to things no one else could perceive. Pemberton left Willowbend with a heavy heart, convinced that the estate itself was alive in some unnatural way, a slow, deliberate force, patient and observing. His ledger, later stored in the Savannah archives, contained a warning. Willowbend is not merely a house. It is a repository of past sins, desires, and obsessions. Those who enter its halls may see nothing at first, but the estate remembers. And it does not forgive. By the time he returned to Savannah, rumors had already reached the county seat. Strange lights in the windows, servants speaking in hushed tones, and Eleanor Whitmore wandering the halls at night, alone but never truly by herself. The house, it seemed, had begun to wait, for the next witness, the next intrusion, the next who might learn too much about Willowbend and what it demanded in return. And somewhere, in the stillness of the mirror room, Eleanor stared at her reflection, knowing the house would not let her go, no matter how far she ran. By the first week of December, the days over Burke County had grown shorter, and the nights stretched long and oppressive. Willowbend Plantation, once a proud estate of sprawling cotton fields and grand halls, now seemed to shrink under the weight of unseen eyes. Even the air inside the house carried a heaviness, thick with the echoes of unspoken deeds, lingering regrets, and the quiet hum of things best left ignored. Eleanor Whitmore walked the halls as though she were threading a needle through her own mind. Each step was careful, deliberate, and measured, yet her pale gray eyes betrayed the tension underneath. The servants, already wary from the events of the previous months, moved like shadows themselves, silent, careful, watching, always watching. Whispers followed her through the corridors, soft as silk, almost imperceptible unless one listened closely. "She walks alone," one servant whispered to another in the kitchen, "but the house is never empty." The mirror room had become Eleanor's private prison. She spent hours staring at her reflection, tracing lines on the glass with trembling fingers, trying to understand what she saw. Sometimes she thought she saw shapes behind her reflection, moving with a subtle life of their own. Sometimes her own reflection smiled at her, a faint, cruel imitation of her expression, twisted and knowing. She covered the mirrors at times, only to uncover them again, as though drawn to witness something beyond comprehension. At night, Eleanor's dreams were restless. The house spoke to her in whispers but never directly. She felt hands brush her hair, though none were there. Footsteps followed her, but she never caught their source. In her journals, she began writing fragments that seemed to escape reason. The house remembers me. It sees all. Every glance, every sigh, every secret. I am both mistress and prisoner. It waits. Outside the main house, the servants grew more uneasy. Samuel Holt, always near Eleanor, seemed the most sensitive to the estate's silent will. He often lingered in the shadows, his gaze following her movements with uncanny precision. Amos, the butler, and Caleb, the blacksmith, spoke quietly about Eleanor's behavior, but fear kept them from speaking openly. One evening, as the sun sank behind the distant hills, Amos found Eleanor standing in the yard near the old bathhouse. The water inside the basin rippled without wind. Eleanor's eyes were fixed on the surface as though waiting for something to emerge. When Amos cleared his throat, she turned slowly, gray eyes wide. "They are learning patience," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "Every glance, every step, every silence, it has a purpose." Amos said nothing, retreating silently into the house, leaving Eleanor to her thoughts and the rippling water. The estate itself seemed to grow restless. Chairs shifted when no one was near. Footsteps echoed in the empty halls. Doors opened and closed without wind, and shadows stretched in ways that defied reason. Eleanor felt as though the house had a consciousness, patient and deliberate, observing her every movement, her every emotion, her every thought. Late one night she entered the mirror room once more. Candles flickered along the edges, casting long shadows across the walls. Eleanor traced her fingers over the sheets covering the mirrors, hesitating before pulling them away. The reflections were not empty. Figures lingered just behind her own, too tall, too thin, too precise in movement to be human. She staggered back, heart hammering. The shadows seemed to lean forward, aware of her fear, feeding on it. For the first time, Eleanor felt that she might be losing herself entirely. Even the children, sent away to Savannah for safety, could sense something was wrong. Letters arrived at the magistrate's office with words scratched in trembling handwriting. "Mother is not the same. I fear the house. It watches. It waits." Thomas Whitmore, already preoccupied with county duties, read the letters with unease. He tried to dismiss them, attributing the children's fear to imagination, but even he could not ignore the strange occurrences in his home. Misplaced items, cold drafts, fleeting shadows at the edge of his vision. By mid-December, the estate's hold over Willowbend intensified. The servants spoke of Eleanor's presence as though she were already part of the house, not its mistress. When she walked through the hallways, the air grew colder, and even the flickering candlelight seemed hesitant to follow her. The house remembered her past, the events she tried to suppress, and the secrets that weighed on her soul. Eleanor began keeping vigil in the mirror room, night after night. She would trace patterns along the sheets, speak in whispers to no one, and watch her own reflection as though expecting it to answer. Some nights, she thought she saw movement, glimpses of figures behind the glass that mimicked her every action but with subtle differences. One night, she thought a reflection blinked before she did. The servants whispered of the bathhouse too. Water splashed when no one was near. A faint glow could sometimes be seen beneath the door, and the sound of someone moving inside echoed down the hallways. Eleanor, unafraid now, would sometimes enter the bathhouse alone, candle in hand, standing by the basin and staring into the water. The surface would ripple and shimmer as though revealing another world. She wrote in her journal, "The water speaks. It knows me. It shows me what I cannot name. Samuel watches and he understands. But he too is trapped in its patience." As Christmas approached, Willowbend felt suspended in time. Outside, the cotton fields lay dormant, blanketed in morning fog. Inside, Eleanor walked the halls like a figure half alive, half shadow. The servants moved around her carefully, speaking softly to avoid drawing her attention. Even Thomas Whitmore began noticing the peculiar stillness in the house, the lack of sound, the oppressive quiet, and the way shadows seemed to linger just a moment too long. Then one night it happened. Eleanor heard the faintest splash of water from the bathhouse. Candle in hand, she approached slowly. The basin reflected only the dim glow of the candle, but ripples formed on the surface as though someone, or something, had disturbed it. Eleanor leaned closer, whispering into the water, and felt a chill creep up her spine. She realized, with sudden clarity, that the house was no longer merely observing. It had begun to interact. She stepped back, heart hammering, and the candle flickered violently, casting shadows that leapt across the walls. Eleanor understood. Willowbend had claimed her attention, her mind, her very life. And it would not let her go. From the mirror room, a faint whisper echoed, almost audible over the stillness. "We are patient. We are many. And we remember." Eleanor turned, eyes wide, and for a brief instant she saw her reflection smile at her, but not her own smile. Something else, something older, something aware. She knew then that Willowbend was no longer merely a house. It was a presence. And she was trapped within it, slowly unraveling, tethered to its walls, to its whispers, to its shadows. And in the silent corridors, the servants whispered to one another. The mistress is not herself anymore, and the house is hungry. The chapter closed on Eleanor standing alone in the mirror room, candle trembling in her hand, water dripping from unseen sources, and the shadows leaning closer, patient, watching, and waiting. By January 1840, Willowbend Plantation had taken on a life entirely its own. The early morning fog that rolled in from the Savannah River clung to the house like a shroud, curling around the columns and pooling in the low corners of the cotton fields. Even the servants had begun to move cautiously through the estate, as though aware that every step, every glance, could awaken something they did not fully understand. Eleanor Whitmore had become a creature of the house, wandering its hallways from dawn until the late hours of the night. Her candle flickered endlessly, casting long shadows that seemed to follow her from room to room. The mirror room, once the center of her growing unease, had become a sanctuary of sorts, a place where she could attempt to understand what Willowbend wanted from her. She no longer slept, and when she did, her dreams were haunted by visions of past inhabitants, their faces twisted in anguish, their eyes wide as though silently pleading. She had begun to understand, in fragments, that the house was alive in a way that defied reason. Its walls remembered, its floors absorbed, and its mirrors reflected not just appearances, but intentions and desires. The servants spoke in hushed tones, increasingly fearful of what Eleanor might do or what the house might demand. Samuel Holt remained near her at all times, silent, watchful, as if he alone could sense the faint pulse of Willowbend, the subtle vibrations that rippled through the walls when no wind stirred and no footstep fell. Caleb the blacksmith avoided the mirror room entirely, muttering that he could feel the house observing him, weighing him, testing his patience. Eleanor's obsession had deepened. She would stand before the mirrors for hours, tracing her reflection with trembling fingers, murmuring words that no one could understand. Some nights, she saw shapes behind her own reflection, tall, thin, human-like but impossible, moving with a purpose, always watching, always waiting. The shadows seemed to shift independently of her candlelight, bending and twisting as though aware of her gaze. "The house," she wrote in her journal one night, "does not forgive. It does not forget. It watches and it waits. I am its witness and its prisoner." One evening, Eleanor ventured into the old bathhouse. The basin of water shimmered faintly in the candlelight, rippling as though something beneath the surface stirred. She leaned closer, peering into the reflections, and for the first time she felt a connection, not to a person, not to a memory, but to the house itself. It was a pulse, a rhythm, an intelligence that seemed to respond to her presence. The bathhouse had always been her retreat, a place of quiet contemplation, but now it pulsed with a life that made her skin prickle. Eleanor felt the water tug at her hands as she hovered above it. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. Willowbend was aware of her, testing her, probing the edges of her mind. When she returned to the main house, she found Samuel waiting silently in the hall. His eyes were wide, alert, and unnerving in their intensity. He had grown pale, but he seemed to understand the house's demands in a way no one else could. "It watches everything," Eleanor whispered. "Yes," Samuel replied, his voice barely audible. "And it is patient." The nights grew longer, colder, and heavier with expectation. Eleanor wandered through the halls, the candlelight dancing across faded portraits of Rutland ancestors whose eyes seemed alive in the flickering glow. The mirrors reflected not just her movements, but her thoughts, her fears, and perhaps even fragments of the house's own memory. One night, she entered the cellar, the forbidden chamber where Jonathan Pemberton had first noticed the warped iron door. The air was thick and damp, heavy with centuries of memory. She carried only a candle, but it was enough to illuminate the secrets hidden in the shadows. Old journals, ledgers, and fragments of cloth that had been forgotten, yet retained a weight, a presence. As Eleanor moved through the cellar, she heard faint whispers emanating from the walls themselves. They were voices of people long gone, voices that had been absorbed into the house over decades. The whispers formed a kind of rhythm, a cadence that seemed to guide her forward, deeper into the shadows. At the iron door, Eleanor paused. It was warped and rusted, yet a faint glow escaped from its edges. She hesitated, remembering the warnings, the strange occurrences, the servants' fearful whispers. But curiosity, or perhaps something darker, compelled her to push it open. Beyond the door lay a tiny vaulted room, damp and narrow. The walls seemed almost liquid in the flickering candlelight, shimmering and pulsing as though the house itself were breathing. She stepped inside, heart hammering, and the glow intensified, reflecting not just her image but something else behind it. Shadows, tall and thin, moved in ways that defied logic. Eleanor felt a presence, patient, deliberate, aware, something that had been waiting for her, watching her, shaping her thoughts and feeding on her fears. She understood then, with a clarity that made her blood run cold, that Willowbend had always been alive. It remembered every choice, every action, every whispered secret, and it now claimed her as part of its memory. "I am its witness," she whispered, voice trembling. "And it is mine." Outside, the servants noticed changes in the air. The shadows seemed to lean closer to Eleanor, stretching unnaturally along the hallways. Objects moved without explanation. A chair shifted slightly, a basin tipped as though nudged, and faint water droplets appeared on the floor where none should have been. Caleb and Amos avoided the mirror room entirely, whispering prayers beneath their breath as they hurried past. Samuel remained near Eleanor, his silence now a protective vigilance. Even Thomas Whitmore, distant and distracted by county duties, sensed the estate's influence. When he entered the house, the air seemed thick, pressing against his chest. Chandeliers flickered, mirrors reflected unfamiliar shapes, and the faint sound of rippling water echoed through the hallways. He began to understand that Eleanor was no longer merely a person living in Willowbend. She was entwined with the house itself, tethered to its memory, its shadows, and its relentless patience. By mid-January, Eleanor's journal entries had grown fragmented and obsessive. The house remembers every sin, every desire, every broken promise. It watches me. It waits. Samuel understands, though he cannot speak of it. The mirrors, the water, they are alive. They are patient. And I. Her thoughts trailed off, lost to the shadows that crept along the edges of her candlelight. She no longer knew where Eleanor ended and Willowbend began. The house had claimed her attention, her will, and her very sense of self. Every step she took, every glance she cast into the mirrors, every word she whispered to the shadows confirmed it. She was no longer the mistress. She was part of the estate, a living memory within its walls. By February 1840, Willowbend Plantation had fully asserted itself. The cotton fields outside lay barren in the winter frost, but within the house life, or something that resembled it, thrummed quietly, insistently. Every hallway, every mirror, every whispering shadow seemed to pulse with purpose. Eleanor Whitmore was no longer merely a mistress. She had become a conduit, a tether between the estate's restless memory and the living world. The servants had grown even more cautious. Caleb and Amos moved silently through the halls, speaking in whispers only when necessary, careful to avoid drawing the house's attention. Samuel Holt, ever near Eleanor, had become an extension of her senses, a quiet observer who moved as though anticipating the house's subtle manipulations. All three men sensed it. Willowbend was no longer a house, it was a presence, patient and deliberate, and it demanded vigilance. Eleanor herself had grown accustomed to the estate's unnatural rhythms. She spent hours in the mirror room, her pale gray eyes tracing the shadows, the flicker of candlelight, and the faint ripple of the water in the bathhouse basin. Sometimes, the reflections behind her showed not her own movements, but shapes that were slower, deliberate, and undeniably aware. At night, Eleanor wandered the corridors, murmuring words to shadows and mirrors alike. The house responded. The faint scratching of unseen claws on wood, the whisper of footsteps where none should fall, and the subtle tilting of furniture became predictable. Willowbend spoke and Eleanor listened. She was learning its patience, its obsessions, its memory. One evening she approached the bathhouse. The basin glimmered with a faint, unnatural light, and the water rippled as if something beneath the surface stirred. Eleanor leaned over, studying the undulating reflections. For the first time she felt a kinship with the estate, a recognition that Willowbend was aware of her presence, her intentions, and her desires. Samuel Holt followed silently, his shadow stretching long behind her. He had grown pale, silent, yet alert. He understood more than anyone else, sensing not just Eleanor's connection to the house but the subtle threads that tied Willowbend's power to every corner of the estate. Eleanor's lips parted as she whispered into the water, "I see you. I feel you. I am yours." The basin responded with a ripple, a shimmer that seemed to echo her words back to her. And for the first time, Eleanor understood that Willowbend was no longer passive. It was alive in thought, in memory, and in desire. The house's influence extended beyond Eleanor. Servants noticed subtle changes in themselves, a deepening fear, fleeting glimpses of figures moving where no one should be, and faint whispers that seemed to echo their own thoughts back at them. Caleb, working late in the forge, heard his name called repeatedly in the distance, only to find no one there. Amos, arranging linens in the attic, felt hands brush his shoulders when he was alone. Even Thomas Whitmore, away on county business, could sense a subtle unease when he returned. The air in the halls felt heavier, the shadows longer, and the house's presence unmistakable. Eleanor, tethered to Willowbend, walked among them like a conduit, carrying the estate's will in her very breath. One night, Eleanor ventured into the cellar once more, drawn by a whispering that seemed to come from the deepest walls. She carried only a candle, the flame trembling as the air grew colder. At the far end of the cellar, the warped iron door glowed faintly as if responding to her approach. She pushed it open and stepped inside the vaulted chamber. The walls shimmered, liquid and alive, reflecting not just her figure but fragments of the past. Shadows moved independently, stretching and bending in unnatural ways. Eleanor felt herself pulled toward the center of the room, as though the house demanded a closer union. She placed her hands on the damp stone and felt a pulse beneath her fingers, steady, deliberate, undeniable. "You remember me," she whispered. "And I remember you." The house responded with a faint vibration, a subtle acknowledgement, and the reflection in the walls shifted to show shapes that were familiar and yet impossible. Figures of past servants, previous mistresses, and unseen watchers coalesced in the reflections, observing her every motion. As the days passed, Eleanor's connection to Willowbend deepened. She began to anticipate its demands, moving through the house with an awareness that seemed guided by something beyond her own mind. Mirrors reflected her in ways that suggested multiple presences, shadows moved in sync with her steps, and even the air itself seemed to pulse with anticipation. One evening, as she stood in the mirror room, Eleanor felt a subtle warmth at her back. Samuel, standing silently, his eyes reflecting both concern and understanding. She reached out, placing a trembling hand on his arm. He did not speak, only watched as the shadows shifted, as the reflections twisted, as the house's presence wrapped around them both. "It wants us to see," Eleanor whispered. "To understand. To become." Samuel nodded, silent, sensing the weight of her words. They moved together through the halls, observing the subtle manipulations of the house. A chair shifted slightly, a candle flickered in anticipation, and the faintest ripple ran through the bathhouse basin. Willowbend was no longer passive. It was aware, deliberate, and alive. The estate's control was subtle but unrelenting. Eleanor felt the influence in every breath, every glance, every heartbeat. The servants, though cautious, began to adapt, moving in rhythm with the house, anticipating its demands, and avoiding the rooms where the presence was strongest. Caleb and Amos whispered that the house seemed almost jealous, its will concentrated in Eleanor, and its attention focused on anyone who entered the halls without permission. The culmination of this influence came one evening when Eleanor stood in the mirror room, watching her own reflection. Shadows moved behind her, coalescing into forms that mirrored her movements but were distinctly separate. The candle flickered violently, and the room seemed to stretch, elongate, and pulse with anticipation. Eleanor placed her hand on the glass and felt a connection, a bridge between herself and Willowbend, between the present and the memories embedded in the walls. "I am yours," she whispered, her voice trembling. "And you are mine." The shadows shimmered in response, bending closer, acknowledging her claim. Samuel watched silently, understanding that the estate had claimed Eleanor entirely. She was no longer a mistress, no longer a visitor, but a vessel through which Willowbend exerted its influence. By early March of 1840, Willowbend Plantation had become something unrecognizable, even to those who had lived within its walls for decades. The cotton fields lay silent under the frost, and the grand halls of the main house, once symbols of wealth and prosperity, now resonated with a different pulse, a quiet, deliberate, patient life of their own. Every creak of a floorboard, every flicker of candlelight, and every whisper of the wind carried the weight of memory, desire, and the invisible eyes of the house. Eleanor Whitmore had fully surrendered to Willowbend. She walked the halls not as a mistress but as a vessel, her will entwined with the estate's. Her pale gray eyes, once bright with curiosity and intelligence, now reflected a depthless awareness, a consciousness that seemed to extend beyond herself. She no longer questioned the shadows or the whispers. Instead, she listened, anticipating, responding, and moving in rhythm with the house. Samuel Holt, ever silent, followed her like a shadow of his own. Though he could feel the estate's pulse and understood Eleanor's connection, he remained the only servant whose presence carried a sense of equilibrium, a fragile tether between the house's growing influence and the mortal world. Caleb and Amos kept their distance, wary of the estate's subtle manipulations, whispering prayers beneath their breath, and avoiding the mirror room entirely. It was on a night heavy with fog that Eleanor first sensed the culmination of Willowbend's will. The mirrors in the hallways had begun to shimmer with an unnatural light, reflecting not just her image but multiple versions, fragments of time, memory, and shadow, all converging in silent testament to the house's dominance. She moved from room to room, observing the reflections, tracing the movements of the shadows, and feeling a subtle pull from the old bathhouse. The water in the basin rippled without wind. Eleanor leaned closer, staring into the surface, and felt a connection that transcended comprehension. Willowbend spoke not in words, but in sensation, memory, and anticipation. The pulse of the house throbbed through her, a rhythm that echoed in her very bones. It demanded acknowledgement, obedience, and recognition of the power it had claimed. "I am yours," Eleanor whispered, voice trembling but resolute. "And you are mine." The basin rippled once more, faint but deliberate, as if confirming the bond. Shadows in the room shifted, coalescing behind her reflection, acknowledging the claim and bending closer in patient, deliberate attention. Meanwhile, in the main hall, Samuel Holt and the remaining servants moved cautiously. The air was thick, oppressive, and alive. Even Thomas Whitmore, visiting after a brief county trip, felt the house's presence pressing against him. Chandeliers flickered, mirrors reflected shapes that were never there, and the faintest echo of water splashing could be heard from rooms no one occupied. Eleanor descended the grand staircase, her candle casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. The house responded to her movement. The floorboards shifted, almost imperceptibly, guiding her path, while the portraits of Rutland ancestors seemed to lean forward, their painted eyes alive and watching. She moved toward the center of the hall, where a faint glow emerged from the floorboards beneath the old family rug. With deliberate caution, Eleanor pulled back the rug and found the entrance to the estate's original root cellar. The air smelled of damp earth, old wood, and something far older, a memory embedded deep within the soil. The door creaked open, revealing the chamber beneath, where Willowbend's dark legacy had taken root generations ago. Within the root cellar, Eleanor found fragments of journals, ledgers, and objects long forgotten. They shimmered with an energy that was neither light nor shadow, but something in between, a presence that spoke of memory, desire, and obsession. She ran her fingers over the faded pages, reading entries that chronicled the lives, sins, and secret indulgences of the Rutland family. Each word vibrated with the pulse of the house, confirming that Willowbend was more than walls, wood, and stone. It was alive. It had remembered her, claimed her, and now demanded a final acknowledgement. Eleanor knelt, placing her hands on the cold stone, feeling the pulse beneath her fingers, and whispered, "I belong to you. All that I am, all that I will be, it is yours." The cellar responded with a low hum, the walls pulsing, shadows elongating, and water dripping rhythmically from unseen cracks. Eleanor's connection to the house deepened, entwining her consciousness with Willowbend itself. She was no longer a visitor or mistress, she was part of the estate, a living memory embedded within its walls. Outside, the servants observed strange occurrences with increasing dread. Caleb swore that shadows moved independently, stalking him along the hallways. Amos reported hearing whispered conversations in rooms he had never entered. Even Samuel, ever vigilant, felt the estate's influence pressing against the living world. It was subtle, patient, deliberate, and inescapable. Thomas Whitmore, returning from the hall, noticed Eleanor's absence and followed faint echoes of her footsteps. The house guided him subtly, almost testing him. When he entered the mirror room, he found her standing before the basin, eyes fixed on the water, shadows curling around her form. For a brief instant, he could see the pulse of Willowbend in her very being, a rhythm that seemed to extend beyond the mortal world. "Eleanor," he whispered, voice trembling. She turned, gray eyes reflecting not just her own face, but countless echoes of the house's memory. Her voice, calm and resolute, cut through the silence. "Thomas, it is too late. Willowbend has claimed me. I'm no longer myself. I belong to the estate, and the estate belongs to me." The final hours of Eleanor's surrender were marked by a quiet, deliberate ceremony. The mirrors reflected her in fragments, past, present, and a hint of future that no mortal could comprehend. The water in the bathhouse basin shimmered, rippled, and glowed with a light that seemed alive. Shadows moved independently, bending and stretching as though acknowledging her submission. Samuel watched silently, understanding that the bond between Eleanor and Willowbend was complete. Caleb and Amos whispered prayers, though they knew the estate's influence was beyond human interference. Even Thomas Whitmore, stunned and pale, recognized that Willowbend had achieved what no one had dared imagine. It had claimed the mistress entirely, weaving her essence into its walls, floors, and mirrors. "The house is patient," Eleanor whispered, placing her hand on the basin. "And now I am patient with it. Forever." By dawn, Willowbend had settled into a new rhythm, one that would persist for generations. The shadows remained, the mirrors reflected not just appearances but intentions, and the house's pulse continued, steady, deliberate, eternal. Eleanor's presence was no longer just physical. It was memory, consciousness, and essence, embedded into the very structure of Willowbend. The servants resumed their duties, cautious but obedient, fully aware that their mistress was no longer Eleanor in any conventional sense. Samuel remained her guardian, a witness to the final claim, while Caleb and Amos kept their distance, praying that the estate's influence would not extend to them. Thomas Whitmore left Willowbend that morning, pale and shaken, carrying with him the understanding that some things, some legacies, were too dark, too deliberate, and too patient to confront. The house had won. The mistress had been claimed. And the shadows of Willowbend continued their eternal vigil. Epilogue: The Legacy of Willowbend. 4 years the estate remained unchallenged. Visitors spoke in hushed tones of strange lights, eerie reflections, and the quiet presence of a woman who seemed more spirit than flesh. Servants whispered about the shadows, mirrors, and the occasional ripple of water in rooms no one occupied. Willowbend had become legend, a silent, patient observer of all who entered its halls. Eleanor Whitmore's journals, later discovered hidden in the deepest corners of the root cellar, chronicled her descent, her surrender, and her final unity with the house. They revealed the estate's influence, its subtle manipulations, and its relentless patience. Scholars, historians, and local storytellers all agreed, Willowbend was no mere house. It was alive. And Eleanor had become its heart. The estate remains today, a testament to the dangers of ambition, curiosity, and the hidden pulse of history itself. Those who walk its halls claim to hear whispers, to feel shadows, and to see ripples and mirrors long after the candlelight has died. Willowbend is patient. Willowbend is deliberate. And Willowbend remembers.